So just to give you some perspective on where I was and where I've been, I was just bringing up this topo map so you could see how green everything is around me, like in the middle of the wilderness where I was. So it's a big map. This is a map of the southern half of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, which is in Idaho and Montana, which most of you all know because you're from here. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, sorry,
okay.
you have to project. Yeah.
Okay, I can project. I'll try. Thank you, Christopher. Okay, so I'm just going to point out where I was. Obviously, so let's see. Missoula would be way up here. And there is one road that connects two of the largest wilderness areas in the lower United States. This road is called the Magruder Corridor, and it connects, it's the only road between the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, which is 2-point-something million acres, and the Selway Bitterroot, which is 1.3 about. So there is one road that bisects nearly 3 million acres of wilderness. It's pretty vast. I'm sure many of you have been there. I had not, and it was very intimidating. So I'm going to show you where I was. So the road comes down here, keeps going, keeps going. It keeps going into Idaho. You actually cross Idaho right here at Nez Perce Pass. It's like 7,000 feet, a little under 7,000 feet. Keep going. And then right here, there's a little spur road that goes up to the Selway River, where the Selway River meets the White Cap, what you all call a creek, but I call it creek. And this is the Paradise Guard Station, which is an administrative cabin. Thank you, Christopher. I'm going to watch the time as well. Okay, I'm going to put on a timer so I can be respectful of time. It's an administrative cabin that is no longer used for the public. And through this partnership with the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation and Open Air and the West Fork District of the U.S. Forest Service and the Bitterroot National Forest, they have this cool program. So I was really lucky to be there. I actually had to come back because you might not be able to see it, but the stitches are out now. But I had an injury while I was there the very first week, and I got a skin puncture wound. I was hiking with a wilderness ranger. His name is Jack Ader, and he's amazing, and you'll probably run into him down there. And it was just a freak accident. I was fine, but it was bleeding a lot, so I had to come back out, and it took about 8 hours to. We were hiking in this area to inventory a wilderness campsite that's an undeveloped campsite. It's no longer used, but it's used casually. And because I have worked with the Forest Service doing wilderness character monitoring, I wanted to go with Jack. And so my pack just happened to roll down the mountain by accident. And so I dove down the mountain to grab it, and I missed it, but then I got it. And when I got it, I came back up the mountain and saw a stick sticking out of my forearm. So I did what you're not supposed to do and what they train you in wilderness first aid to never do, which is pull it out, because I was so shocked, and I've never had that happen before. So I pulled it out, and it was bleeding, and it was lacerated. And I just said, let's keep going, it's fine, it doesn't hurt that much. And of course I did not have a first aid kit with me because we were just going for one night. Never do that. So it was fine, but we had to hike out, and then I came back to Missoula. So the rest of my residency has been here, and the stitches just came out a few days ago. And what I wanted to talk about, and what's on this handout, and some of the poems I'm going to read, some of them were written here in response. So maybe I'll read those if there's enough time. I won't be able to read all of them, but the fact that I had to leave was very dislocating and very confusing, and kind of like, oh wow, what just happened? And through the opportunity to just be in residence in Missoula in this amazing house with these other artists, some of whom are here, in a wonderful town, I just realized, well, it gave me the space to reflect and really just think about, well, what am I doing here? Why did I even want to go to the wilderness? And what am I drawn to wilderness spaces for in the first place? And the fact that this didn't work as planned is part of this creative process that I guess I'm just going to go with. And for me, it's really a metaphor. I really struggle with the tradition of environmental writing and wilderness writing in the United States as a gay man. It's something that intimidates me. It's something that is very masculinist. It's very aggressive, whether no matter how you identify on the gender spectrum. It's an assertive conquering of the landscape. That's the tradition, especially in the Western United States. And it's very intimidating, and I also love it. And that's the kind of writing that I studied in graduate school. It's kind of the writing that I teach to college students during the year. And it's something that I aspire to continue writing, but I really struggle with this tradition because it's kind of at odds with what I struggle to accept about myself, which is I'm not necessarily this aggressive masculinist person, that I feel like spaces like this, these incredible, awe-inspiring landscapes, sort of get used in these ways that feel kind of like a conquering, and it's confusing. And I felt that when I was at Paradise, not because anyone did anything wrong or bad. It was the amazing experience, but it's just inherent to me, to these kinds of landscapes, that there is a type of the gestures, the behavior, the language that's coded into the landscape is very just like self-reliance, hunting, all these things that if you don't grow up like that, it can be very intimidating. I also really respect those traditions and wish I knew how to hunt for my own food. I don't. I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, so that's not where I come from. And but it's what I've spent most of my adult life chasing after and what I'm really interested in. So that's why I was so happy to go down there, and the fact that I had to leave was like, well, right, this is actually kind of the story I have with this whole tradition of writing. So, perfect. So that's what I'm going to think about and write in response to, and I am going to go back down there, not as part of the residency, but once I got a taste of it, I was like, oh, these trails in this district of the forest are just so remote. They're not used as often. They're, it seems like most people from Missoula go to the, Stevensville district or the Lolo area, the Lolo drainage, not all the way down there. So it's really remote and beautiful, and I can't wait to go back. So, all right, we're about 5 minutes in. So, I wanted to just start because I didn't know who the audience would be. I just wanted to start with a little exercise. So I applied to this residency as a poet because I'm a poet, but my training is really as a critic and a scholar of literature. That's what I went to school for. And that's really what I'm most comfortable with. Writing poetry takes a lot of courage. It involves a lot of self-reflection, for me at least, and it's very powerful. But I realized that maybe some people who are attending this have never read poetry, or maybe they don't know poetry, or maybe poetry is intimidating. And so I just want to do like a very quick exercise to show you what poetry is. So if you could take your right hand, or your left hand, it doesn't really matter. Take your right hand, and just put it right here. And for about 30 seconds, I just want you to notice what you feel on your hand. Okay, it's about 30 seconds. Can anyone just volunteer like a word or two that they just felt? Like what kind of pattern or rhythm?
Warm.
Warm. Ooh, I love that. Okay, what else?
Slight.
Slight? Is that you? No. What was it?
Slight.
Slight, like a slight beat?
Oh, the slightness of my hand.
The slightness of your hand. I felt wiry because I've drinking a lot of coffee. any other, I know it's real quick, but just any other quick observations? Yes.
On the exterior of my hand, the reverberations of the bird calls.
Oh, wow, you felt that. That's really cool. Okay, so all these things that you're talking about would, for me, that would be data for a poem. That would be observations for a poem. That would be the composition of a poem. Poetry, for me at least, and I do not speak for poetry, but my entry into poetry is that it's from the body. It's also from the mind. It's very intellectual, but you can't outthink it. I don't think you can. It comes from the body. It's a somatic experience. And so poems are made of rhythm. They're made of sound. They're made of space. They're musical compositions, which is what I wrote on here. Poems are musical compositions. You can score sound on the page in many ways through deliberate use of space, sound, rhythm, image, texture, taste. I mean, these are just a few. So I gave you two very different examples of some poems that do this, that are contemporary poets that I really admire. One of them used to live in Missoula, Joanna Klink, and she taught at the University of Montana. And this is from her recent book called The Night Fields, which is this book, which has kind of been like biblical for me all summer. Oh wow, that's a lot better. What'd you do?
I turned it up. The master.
The master. Perfect. So this is an excerpt from The Night Fields. And yeah, this book is just out, and it's recent, and it's based in, a lot of this is written here in this valley. I know she's no longer here, but reading this book, it's very clear that there's a lot about Missoula in here. So this is just one, and I wanted people to see, like, look how she's playing with the composition. And I'll just read this. There is a way to live, not racked by guesswork. Simply to pivot and claim one direction, to make your path felt if you hold. So, to me, this poem, I mean, this is just an excerpt from a larger poem, but what do you notice about how the words are arranged on the page? Just observations. What does it look like to some people? Is it a straight line? Is it?
It's going different directions.
It's going different directions, yeah. And what is the subject that she's writing about here? Life, and how it goes in different directions, and what it means to claim one direction, and how do you know that's your direction? And so the content of this poem, which is that, how do you trust a path? How do you make a path? Is it racked by guesswork? How do you ever know? Is guesswork the truth? Maybe that is how you know. For me, the reason I like this is because the content of this poem speaks through the form of it. So it's arranged on the page in a way that meanders a little bit. And that is what the subject of these words is. So the form and the content are aligned here. For me, that's how I read it. Other people might read it very differently, which is awesome. And then I gave another example from C.D. Wright, who's another contemporary poet who died a few years ago. And she writes a lot about southern landscapes. She's originally from Arkansas. And this is a poem of hers that I love. Count your fingers, count your toes, count your nose holes, count your blessings, count your stars, lucky or not. Count your loose change. Count the miles to the state line. Count cars at the crossing. Count the ticks you pulled off the dog. Count your shells. Count the points on the antlers. Count the New Jack's keys. Count the beds you've got to let. Count your cards. Cut them again. Does this make any sense to people? This poem is really weird to me. Like, what are some people thinking when you read this? Like, what the hell is she saying? Or is this a grocery list? Or, I don't know. Any
This
ideas?
is about life.
Yeah, why? It is. What do you mean? What about life?
Well, when I read this, I see my kids telling me they count everything.
That's what I just said to our son. Dad counts everything.
Yeah. And when you count things, how do you account for them? Like, spatially. Usually through a list. Typically. I mean, that's not the only way, but like a grocery list is, it's listed. It's a sequence. And so the form of this poem, to me, again, it's like, it can seem very simple and almost like ridiculous, but that is what poetry allows you to do. It allows you to play. It allows you to get totally lost, and allows you to just really explore in a way that I don't think prose can allow as easily. And I write essays, and I write journalism. That's one of my jobs. And it's really hard because every sentence has to make sense and it has to have an internal logic. Poetry just lets you explode the logic and just like completely explore and just pinwheel all over the place. And I feel like that's what these two poets are doing in very different ways. And I think that's why, like, you don't necessarily have to go to school to study poetry. It's already in you. It's like already there. It's like the things you notice in your heart, that rhythm, whatever you notice coming from you, those are your poems. Like, you don't have to like be some famous person. Like, the things you notice are your poems, and you can arrange them on a page in whatever the hell way you want. And that's why I really like poetry. Okay, so let me see. We're pretty good for time. Okay. So I'm going to move to the next part, which is more about, what I'm interested in, why I wanted to do this residency, which is the relationship between poetry and ecology, or literature and ecology, or what I just call environmental writing. A lot, when I was down at Paradise, and oftentimes, not even here, but when I'm really interested in natural history. I interview a lot of scientists for articles that I'm usually working on. And it's just totally out of my range. It's like I'm a literature person, but for some reason I just can't stay in my lane. I just love like going everywhere else. And so I'm constantly just like talking to scientists, and I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I don't understand this, but I'm totally fascinated by it. And something I've started realizing is that poems and science, for me, they utilize a very similar method. Scientists obviously abide by the scientific method, which is rooted in the Enlightenment, which is rooted in a very specific way of entering the world, using your mind to reason things out rather than just letting your senses wash over you. The difference between sense and sensibility. That comes from the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. And the scientific method is a product of that. And I think poetry completely is antithetical to that, but I do think that there is some connection. And so I wanted to talk about that here because I'm interested in poems that investigate ecological problems. I don't write those poems often, but I'm really interested in writing about them and reading them. I just wanted to talk for a little bit about poetry and science. So what are the connections here? Well, both make use of observation, data, and field study. Just like a botanist goes into the field to study the involucres of a plant or to identify some rare species. Poets go into the field. Poets are observing, except the field isn't something that's really far away. It's like right in your body. It can also be right here. Like, I'm sure there's like 20 poems that could be written just about us sitting here in this, like, there's so many things going on here that you could document and write a poem about. So both are trying to prove some sort of hypothesis or hunch about our world or society and see if the data backs up that hypothesis. So for me, I have a lot of hunches, I have a lot of suspicions, I have a lot of theories, I have a lot of intuitions about what I think it means to be a man in the world, or things that have to do with class and sexuality. Those are things that really interest me. And I have a lot of hunches as a result of how I grew up and how I moved through the world. And so when I'm observing things in the field, it usually aligns with one of those hunches and proves it or proves it wrong. And then if it's good data, I write a poem about it. It's like, yeah, see, this proved what I said about queerness. Or yeah, this proved what I said about, this thing that's going on in our society that I can't figure out, but I know it's there. And I'm going to keep trying to get at it through writing poems. Both require that you follow your curiosity, taking the freedom to wander far into an idea. That's a quote from Joanna Klink. And completely trust what you notice so you can capture quality data. If you're not fully present in the field, if you don't have the skills to observe everything, as a scientist, you're going to miss data. As a poet, it's like I'm like a film negative, and everything is just coming in, and then I'm going to develop it and process it through chemicals. And that alchemical process is the writing. And I think that's something about this, why I wanted to do this residency, and that's what I wanted to speak about a little more before I read a few, is that it takes a lot of complete surrender to just, I've never had an experience like this where I go somewhere to just work on poems. I've never done that. This is the first time I've done an artist residency, and I was in a place that was really vast and really isolated, which is also what the experience for me of trying to write poems is. So it was like double vastness, double isolation, double intensity. And to be able to trust that and just go into that takes a lot of courage for me, and it's really scary. And I think that good scientists completely trust their hunches. They completely trust what they're seeing. They completely trust that they are out to prove something. And the data they gather might not bear out that truth, but they're going to at least find it. And I feel like the poets that I look to, they do that. They completely surrender to their observation. And that's why, for me, writing poetry is so important, and why I wanted to do this is because it's about bringing a quality of attention to the world. It's about being present in a certain way. And to have the opportunity to go somewhere for a month and do that is like such a gift, regardless of whether I'm at in a vast wilderness area or in a bustling home of artists on a busy street in Missoula. It doesn't really matter. It's about tapping into that quality, and it's really hard to do that if you don't. It's a practice. It's a practice like any artistic practice and process. So I listed here, what makes good data for a poem? Well, it's the peculiarities, it's the oddities, it's the details, it's the surprises, it's the things that don't make sense. I don't know. It's the way the bird calls bounced off your hand, Addie. I don't know. I mean, that's like really odd and interesting. And yeah, I'm just asking some questions here. How do you know if your data is significant, worthy, or original? When do you ignore it? Like my experience in this residency is that I've spent days, I don't go anywhere without a notebook, and I just have like reams of observations. And at the end of the day, I'm like, is this all horseshit or is this good? Like, I can't tell. And like, it takes a while to figure, sorry, I swear sometimes, but there's no kid, well, Finn is fine. Yeah. Finn later, I can't remember. But, so, yeah, I mean, I've needed to come here to have this opportunity to access this kind of practice that I don't typically allow myself to do. And to just gather data and just observe and gather all the observations and put them somewhere and then figure out what it's trying to say. And so, like, I sometimes feel like I've wasted days because I'm like, oh, well, I have all these observations. I spent all this time, like, detailing what this person said to me or how this person spoke to me or what their gestures were. And I'm like, well, where am I going to put this? Like, is this a poem? And what I'm learning and what I've learned over the years is you just kind of let it sit there, and if you keep seeing those patterns, to trust it. And they are a poem. And sometimes they're just about using that muscle. It's like meditation. You just sort of have to, like, the more you do it, the better you get at it, but you're always, really always beginning at it. It's always a practice, no matter how long you've been doing it. So the more you use that muscle, the better. So, and the last thing I want to say about this is that poems don't lie. Well, at least I don't think they do. What you notice is what you notice. They are transcribing your psyche. They are transcribing a set of values or hunches that you have. Every single one of us might notice very different things about this field in front of us. And that's a gift. So what you notice is actually the truth that's trying to come out of you. And poems can like extract that. And because they distill it in a really clarified way. Where you're just putting the focus and the pressure on the details. Like count your nose holes, or count your blessings, or count your loose change. Like, it's such random detail, but there's a meaning to that. Like, she's trying to make sense of something here. These are the things she notices in the world she's coming from. So, yeah, I think of poems as sort of clarifying your inner truths, like a mirror, reflecting back to you your own values. So it's really hard and really scary sometimes because it's kind of a confrontation. Okay, and the last thing I want to say on this section was I wanted to read this quote from the famous wilderness researcher and wildlife biologist Aldo Leopold. This is from his essay From the Round River, a Parable, written, probably 80 years ago. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Whew. So, this quote is really important to me because I think poets and I think scientists, in particular ecological scientists, systems thinkers, when you are trained to see how systems work, often you see what's missing from them. Often you are trained to see how they're not working. And so someone like what Leopold is saying here, someone like an ecologist actually lives in a world of wounds where they're so well versed and they understand the inner relationships and the complex layers between levels in a system, from the soil to the atmosphere, that they see a lot that's not working. And so something I've been thinking a lot about is like, well, this is an important question. Why are poets and ecologists both essential for solving the extinction and biodiversity crisis or the climate crisis? You need both. There's something, and I don't necessarily have the answer, but I was wondering, if any of you have answers or think about that. And I'm going to read some poems. But why do you all think that poets and ecologists both can solve this crisis that we're in? Although it's really clear, much clearer here today, but the problems we're having with wildland fires and wilderness fires, and I want to give people a chance to just share for a minute. Maybe you don't have anything, but just think about it. Yeah. What's your name?
Michelle.
Michelle. Nice to meet you.
You too. Maybe it has to do with that poets and scientists both tell us about how we're relating to the world.
Yeah.
And then that's raw data.
Yeah.
Like,
That's super cool. Yeah. Thank you. What else? Stony!
I think about this a lot too.
Oh, you do?
I think a bit about like the difference of what scientists have access to, like the sensing organs scientists have often include a lot of technology, and they have other apparatuses that kind of give them a certain scope, but they're also bound to a certain code of conduct with how they can ask questions and how they can answer questions. And so sometimes, like where the poet starts with the hand on the heart and the sensing of the body, the sensing of our own, like our sensing organs is what the poet can enact. They like complete each other, right?
Yeah.
Like you can have this extrasensory engagement as well as...
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's like an extrasensory apparatus. Like poets and ecologists or scientists of many sorts can have these like really, really intense sonar radars and antenna.
And I think the word solve is it's almost problematic.
Right, exactly. As if you can solve it.
As if you can solve, but I think the role of poets or artists, even, I'll broaden it, is to call attention to and create urgency around the matters that perhaps are left into the hands of science to actually solve and make a difference. So in some ways, that's part of the solution.
Right.
That word solve could go a lot of ways.
Yeah. It can be, maybe a better word is for digesting or metabolizing or dealing with, or, because I don't think you can solve it. I mean, that's like putting a Band-Aid over it just to feel better, but you can't solve it. There are some solutions though.
I was going to say, someday.
Yeah.
Lots
Any
of
other
people
thoughts on? Oh, good, over here, yeah. Is it Lori?
Lorraine.
Lorraine.
Yeah. Well, you need the left side and the right side of the brain. You need all parts of the brain to work together, to come together.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
John.
John.
Yeah. I would say that there's a responsibility to kind of get past the denial of scientists sometimes. It's like, oh, well, that's just our job. We're just reporting the facts. But I think that last bit of that quote is so important because there are some major damage to the environment that poets and ecologists have to address, and they're really the only ones who are out there who are doing it. You look at some of the mining and corporate timber and political considerations there. So it's kind of like a firewall, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
It's really important that people have that platform.
Yeah.
Because I mean, really, when you look at societal things, just the whole denial of structural racism, oh, everything's cool, that happened in the past, let's move on.
Right.
I think that's a huge problem with environmental issues.
Oh, yeah.
We logged a long time ago, so there's no damage anymore. But there is.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Christopher, were you going to say something? Or no, I don't know your name.
I'm Stella.
Stella.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about the part where he says that an ecologist must either harden his shell, or, well, I guess just like that scientists are expected to have hard shells, and I think that they, in some ways, need to remove themselves from their work in order to gather such sometimes painful data, where it's like almost the flip side for poets and artists, where we're expected to have like some sort of deeper access to emotional vulnerability. So I think that in that way they can work together to, poets can view the data that's harvested for the scientists and like regurgitate it through an emotional lens.
Yeah. That's what I think about. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, totally. Yeah, I'm working on an article right now about ecological grieving. It's and that is something that's been coming up with the two botanists that I went to the Mojave Desert and followed them around for like a week, and they've spent their entire careers trying to save these very specific plants that are really, like, you would never, I mean, you could step on them, you wouldn't even know they're there. And this part where I was in the greater Death Valley region in Nevada, and on the Nevada-California border, it's a very lithium-rich area, or certain areas are very lithium-rich, and there's a couple of open-pit lithium boron mines that are slated to go in, and it's right where these rare species live. And these scientists have spent their careers trying to protect this species, and they are seeing the world, their landscape that they love, die around them. And that was something that came up when I was reporting. It's like, oh my God, like, I think I need to help them. Well, I felt my presence there was actually just to help them realize it was okay to talk about what they felt, because they're not used to doing that, and that you don't get a training in school for that. So, so check the September issue of High Country News, or October, I don't know which issue it's going to be. I haven't, I'm still working on it, but, all right, okay, so I guess I'm going to shift now. Okay, so I have like 20 minutes. I'm going to read some poems, and I wanted to just, if you could flip the sheet over, I wanted to give you, a little more. 15 minutes, but so I've talked about this a little bit, but I just wanted to give some context for the things I'm going to be reading and some of the things that I've been thinking about and that I haven't written about yet, but that I know I'm going to based on my time here, which is that I mentioned at the very beginning, this tradition of writing about Western landscapes and wild wilderness landscapes, and the language of conservation that often, especially in wilderness, focuses on pristine nature, untrammeled nature. That's the language from the 1964 Wilderness Act. Non-native species that should not be in an environment. Well, the question is like, well, are immigrants not welcome in a wilderness? Are immigrant species not welcome in a pristine, pure environment? And sometimes non-native species can actually help. Not often, but typically no. You don't want non-native species to colonize a wilderness. But what I'm interested in as a poet is the language we use around this stuff. And I think that wilderness discourse often inadvertently allies itself with xenophobia and ecofascism, and it's something that I really struggle with. It's like, well, I don't want to write stuff that's like that, but I love the wilderness, and I also don't really. I've really come up against my own qualms about that when I'm in those spaces, and that is exactly what I felt down at the Paradise Guard Station. There's a number of outfitters down there who are wonderful and super kind, and they bait bears. You can do that in Idaho. You can't do that on the Montana side, but you can hunt bears on the Idaho side. People that are paying a lot of money to come hunt elk in the fall. It's just this type of bearing in the world. It is not something I'm used to, and I was very intrigued by it, and also intimidated. And I think for me, what I've been reflecting on is like, well, yeah, in the Anglo-American tradition of colonization, you have all this language around manifest destiny and conquering the West, and really harmful types of language comes from that. And so I was at this bookstore the other day in Hamilton. I think it's called Page One. It's a great bookstore. And they just had this book sitting in their used section, and it's from National Geographic, and it's called Into the Wilderness. And I just wanted people to look at the image on the cover. And right next to that book was another book called Mountain Men. John Coulter, The Lewis and Clark Expedition, and The Call of the American West. And then another book, which I've been reading, which has been amazing and super helpful, about this amazing river up here, the Lochsa. This is the Lochsa story, about land ethics in the Bitterroot Mountains. It's really helped me understand this landscape. It's this incredible environmental history. I would say it's also written from a very particular male perspective at a particular time in American history. And the image on the cover is of one man looking over a vast landscape, taking it all in. And to the left is an image from that National Geographic book called Into the Wilderness, a very famous explorer, John Fremont. I don't know if I'm saying his last name correctly, but and look what it says, the caption. John Fremont, Fremont conquers, quote, the highest peak of the Rocky Mountains, unquote, in an engraving that captures his quicksilver flamboyance, while erring in every detail, his clothing, the flag and the staff, and the fact that dozens of peaks in the Rockies are higher. And he is hoisting his flag, and what does that flag say? Liberty. So, yeah, this is a lone man at the top of a peak with a flag that says liberty, and that is something that is coded into these spaces for certain people, and that is a legacy of conquest and genocide and manifest destiny, and it's everywhere. And the writing of those landscapes comes coded in that language, and it's really hard sometimes. So this is a quote from a journal I like called Fouled States, and it's something that's been guiding me recently. It says, for those of us actively engaged in rewriting our understanding of place, words, gestures, and gazes can become tools, shaping work that swims against the current of established narratives. And so how I think of my own work really is that I'm paying attention to words, gestures, and gazes to swim against the current of established narratives around wilderness, to make something more like a queer wilderness or a queer ecology, which is looking at the relationship between, well, if you're marginalized in society for many different reasons, but I'm particularly interested in sexuality as a gay man. So what is the relationship between being marginalized and having a very strong, deep connection to wilderness landscapes? For me, that is about, wilderness has always been something I've really connected to because it's where I felt I could be safe. It's where I felt I could be free for the first time. It's where I felt like no one was judging me and I could just be me and everything was just wild. And I was like, this is what I've always wanted. And so for me, there's a very strong connection between queerness and wilderness. But to get to that connection, you have to go through all this stuff like images like this. And I don't know exactly how to deal with that. So that's what this residency has been about. And so yeah, I'll read a few poems. Are there any questions about those images? This isn't like, I go into teacher mode sometimes. Okay, well. All right, so I'm not gonna be able to read all of these, but thank you, Stony, for printing these. And I also really wanted to thank Molly and Michael, who have been helping out with Open Air. I wanted to thank Stony's mom, who's not here, who's amazing and was very encouraging the other night. And I also wanted to thank, there's 3 rangers in particular who aren't here, but I've been talking to them and they really, really helped me when I was having an injury. And that would be Tanya Neidhart, Eric Strayer, and Jack Rader. They all work in the West Fork District, and they're amazing. All right, so I'm going to read a few poems. Okay. All right. Let me lower this a little bit. All right. This one's called "When Paradise Doesn't Work Out." I'm reminded that I often chase aftertastes, elusive partners with remote emotional harbors, vast natural landscapes whose ecologies are some backcountry escape. Those exclusive reaches where one is always a guest with isolated access. A trespass whose mental challenge to navigate I often mistake as a proxy for virility. Yes, the federally designated wilderness whose self-willed expanses free me from my own distractions. Yes, those feral-minded outdoorsmen whose know-how and easy confidence in out-of-bound ranges bait me. Yes, I'm chasing down my own inadequacies, although failing at it adequately and returning. A turn in thought. I went places today. I did. I got in the car. I had a list. It's patent tasks. This checklist my birthright. I even drove in the left turn lane. All the cars piled up, waiting because of me. A levee on the brink of break. A shipwrecked island, buoyed in bruised light. The power saw run amok, slicing the sawhorse bearing it. I am a nuisance, and the left lane always. I shopped for groceries today. I did it. I walked in, bought the parsnips, the lemons, the sprigs of rosemary. I even had the courage to ask a question at the seafood counter. The tatted musclemen in their boat deck overalls couldn't be bothered more. This poem my entree to their forethought, so I wondered aloud about the halibut, without feeling flat, or holy, or like a flirt. Beginnings relent when emptying. A few moments. Beginnings relent when emptying. Leaded window panes frame the opening. Morning a beginning. Lost at commencing. Dawn lurches as it launches. A violent conception. The piercing onset at outset. How to rest into awakening, divulging, refulgent. Luxuriating as a stirring. Echoes in Genesis. Sepal and despair. Stapled light, heating a hearing, unhinging. Spills, unflooring thresholds of belonging. Filaments shedding, perspiring. Eggshell, whalebone, and gray. Cylinders fluorescing. Acrostics of light, valving, sylvan possibility. Etches of echoes and rapture, release. Matchsticks flint and perforate. Straight edges flock to a fold. Vaporing mist respiring. Rifle light barreling. Beltways of light, lantern and ivory. A terminology of facts. Framing, flush with planning. Execute when relentless. Grow fleet. Susurrate the sequence when sentenced. A wallowing entry. Okay, I'm just gonna do a few more. Skip a few. Okay. Oh, there it is. Dear you, lately I've been thinking about the holy ordinary. Who owns it? Who gets to know it? And who says anything about it? Sign here with your knowingness, a koan to your entrusted superficiality. Lately, I've been trying to talk about self-righteous environmentalists, the ones who celebrate public lands as if it's their private property, the bros who accost the mountains to harvest their masculinity. Yes, you know them? That one. Without sounding like I am right. In fact, I want to sound like a humble Yale PhD, which a former mentor of mine once said she was. She then went on to publish an essay about me and win a lot of awards. She somehow missed the deadline for my recommendation when I applied for a Yale PhD. I am trying to contract thought without flexing some muscle. The violence of aligning oneself with a tradition. The homesprung blackmail, rioting through institutional sabotage. The inertia tunneling deeper into one's own isolate circumspection. The forgiveness, the forgiveness, the forgiveness. All right, one more, two more. I'm gonna skip. On being ghosted. Day 34. That seemingly unimportant voice message that later became the last trace of him. That 1 minute and 2 seconds of violent piousness. His voice. Genuine, vague, gesturing towards all manner of future plans that never happened. His voice. That cliff-hooking tone. A foretelling of rooms in him I didn't know he still hid in. His voice. Something sanded down in it, rough and spacious, for his wishy-washy exuberance. His voice, breathy, exhausted, a specific gesture I now recognize as the art of manufacturing chaos as a way to insulate oneself from intimacy. His voice, a reminder of the biology that split him. His voice, the Latinate vowels his vocal cords couldn't hit now, the striving tone volleying in the back of his throat. His voice, in those higher registers where the estrogen and testosterone minced syllables, the synthesis of the fey, the slight, though not exactly either, yet something that came to matter, ever since being read as a gay man now. His voice, in its spontaneity, the whimsy of a recluse. His voice, in its meandering curiosity, a manipulative, charismatic, scarred and scared, until he disappeared, like this. Okay, last one. Oh, this one's messy. They're all messy, but here we go. All right, you don't know where to go after dinner. You're roaming the long blocks of historic homes, wandering in and out of a feeling unavailable under harsher light. This calmness you keep stepping into, creating new strides in your thinking, fanning out into alleyways of logic. You're traipsing up and down these quiet residential streets, taken by the easy order on the porches, the lights strung up in oversized loops, camping chairs stashed in corners, river towels dangling while drying, aluminum cans crinkled like silver dollars across wooden slats. At the top of one block, the historic rail station. Cobblestone, restored walkways, old municipal benches, a different scale of time here. You cross some boundary you don't understand. A cluster of emotions surging around this opening. A new tonal palette you're grasping. You're circling the perimeter, approaching this older terrain, maneuvering your history. You're brushing against the edges of something whose peripheries kept guiding you. You're penciling in the outlines, configuring its contours, spying a blueprint. Where did you go astray from that slender path that started flaring? When did you stop trusting the traces that tipped you off, now muted and hustling? This suspended state of belonging you're slinging. The train rails fastening a sound you're tracking now, splitting open along built-in lines of weakness for dispersal. No need now to mistake turning around as a decoy, when the right step forward means not collapsing. That's all. All right.